Hello everybody, this is Arun Abraham from the Workbooks team. Today we'll take a look at how to get your log analytics data directly from an Azure resource instead of from a log analytics workspace. So before that, first let's look at how to get it from a log analytics workspace. This is the more common way to do it. Basically, create a control, say the data source is logs, the resource type in this case will be the log analytics, and you'll point us to the exact log analytics workspace you want. So in this case, I've said this guy. So when you run the query, you have to specify what KQL to run, the query itself. In this case, I'm targeting the perf table, and I'm saying, for this particular counter, get me the average of the counter values and segment it by the resources. So at the end of the day, you'll get this table, which has resources, and then the average of the counter value. Now, because we targeted the log analytics workspace, at a high level, you can think of it as a container for telemetry, which has data from one or more resources. In this case, this particular workspace has data from all these resources. Now, because it's that telemetry container, by default, it gets you everything. Right? So if you wanted to filter it down to a small set of resources, you can always add a filter to your query and reduce it down. Now, that's one way to do it. But Workbooks has a much more first-class way to support this scenario, and we'll see that in this demo. So how do you do this? For that, here's another workbook, essentially the same query, but there are some things that are different. So the first thing I've done is added a parameter block here, which allows you to pick one or more subscriptions. And for those selected subscriptions, one or more resource group within those. And for those resource groups selected, what are the VMs within it. So this allows me to quickly pick a set of virtual machines or virtual machine scales. That's one of the other things in here that you want the logs for, right? So at a high level, again, the question you're asking is, give me the logs for this selected virtual machine, and in this case, you could have selected more than one if needed. So same query, I'm looking at that counter, average of that counter by resources. The difference though is, instead of targeting log analytics, I'm going to target virtual machines. So log analytics was right there. That was what we saw previously. In this case, we're going to say virtual machines. And if you didn't want virtual machines, you wanted data from your storage or something else, it's right there, right? And Workbook supports all of these things. You can connect to any of them. So back to the example, we have virtual machines. And the last thing here is I have data bound the input set of virtual machines to this parameter here. So as I select more or less things from this virtual machines, the control will automatically get bound, and you'll see the results just for that. Now, if I run this query, as opposed to the previous case where I got the results for all the virtual machines, here I get the answer only for this particular virtual machine. Let's see that in more detail. So I'm going to take a look at more of these. So I'm going to click on this, guys. We'll see that when the result comes back, what's happening underneath this workbook is making a logs call against each of these 4 virtual machines, and the data will come back, and we got the answer for just those 4. We think that this is a better way to think of the problem because you're not thinking in terms of abstract telemetry containers. Instead, you're thinking in terms of the very specific virtual machines you have in your environment. It's a great way to run your queries, write your queries, and think about the exact scope that you care about. So that's the example that you see here. Right? Now, what are some of the things you need to take into consideration? Notice that I had picked the resource type virtual machine here. And as long as all the types that are selected for virtual machine, everything looks fine. Let's see what happens when I click on a virtual machine scale set. Virtual machine scale sets also have the perf table, so I expected the data to come back, but what it's telling me is there was no virtual machines found in the set of resources returned by this query, which is true because the resource that it returned was a virtual machine scale set, not a virtual machine, and therefore this whole control is broken, right? So how do we enable scenarios like this where there are resources that target the same table, but there are different types, and you notice Workbooks didn't allow you to multi-select this. Luckily, there's a workaround for this. So the way you do it is same example as before. I add a new hidden variable, and this variable, if I look at the edit mode for this, you'll see that it is of type resource type picker. And in the value section, all I said is the types that are supported are virtual machines. So this is the full ID of the type, and the other one that's supported is virtual machine scale set. And If I open this up, you'll see the value, these two were selected, and which means that the current scope is select both virtual machine scale sets of virtual machines. Now let's see what happens here. So same query as before, the logs data source. This time when I say a resource type, instead of saying virtual machines or virtual machine scale sets, I'm saying actually bind that to the parameter resource scope. So this is the same as this guy, right? So what I've done is I'm saying run the query, but run it against two different types, and the data the resource scope is still virtual machines, which is this, which is virtual machines, but it also can include virtual machine scale sets. So now when you run the query, you should see the result that comes back to include both the virtual machines and the virtual machine scale set, which is what you see here. Now, this is the way you would handle the case where you have multiple resources sending data to the same table, but multiple resources of multiple types sending data to the same resource. That's the way you handle it in workbooks. And the good thing about this is if you made this a real parameter, you could also control this. You could let your users have control over how it's selected. So that is two scenarios so far. Now, one of the things you may have noticed is as I was running this query is kind of slow to run. And the reason for this is when I choose any of the scopes that I've set so far, we're making individual queries to with respect to each of these resources. Now, if you had 100 of these selected, you can imagine that taking a lot of time. So how can we improve the performance of these queries a little bit? So it turns out that not only do workbooks support the querying at the scope of individual resource types, you can also do it at the scope of subscriptions and resource groups. Now, the advantage of doing it at these large scopes is if, let's say, you had 100 resources in your resource group, instead of making 100 individual calls, you could just make one call to the resource group, and the answer typically gets back to you faster. Similarly, if you make a subscription level call, it'll be faster than doing a call for 1,000 different resources. So we could leverage this fact to do a more dynamic scoping, such that if you had one or a few resources, just make the individual calls. But if as the numbers of these increase, you could be smarter about what scope you could call. So I have an example here for that. Here's the same example as before, same resource type scope that's bound here. But this time I've done something more dynamic in this case. So what do you do here? So the first thing we do is we actually count the number of resources that are eventually selected here. So in this case, this is 2. And how many of them are actually selected. And then we do a heuristic. What we say is, if the number of resources is less than 5, just make the individual resource scope calls. The scope is whatever the underlying data set is. If the number of resources is greater than 5, but the number of resource groups is less than 3, then you make a resource group query. And if the number of selected resource groups is greater than 3, just make the subscription call. We'll see this in action right now. So if I were to select all, these are 2 things that are selected, and so the selected resource group scope is just these 2 types, which means we're making individual resource calls. Let's see what happens if I selected another resource group that could potentially have more types. So in this case, I selected one that has a lot of individual resources. So now the scope turns out to be a resource group. Instead of individual resources, I'm making a resource group call. If you notice, this call came back very fast, right? And if you extended that further and you did more resource groups, this will individually make 1, 2, 3, 4, like all of these calls. You'll notice that now the resource scope has changed to subscription, and I'm making a call against a single subscription, which should yield a faster result than if you were made calls to individual resource groups. So this is one way to have the results come back dynamically based on the selection that a user has made. In this case, all of these things, all of these resource groups. Something that you can use in your system, especially when you're using resource-centric queries. Now, because we expand the scope sort of arbitrarily, one of the things we have to remember in our query to filter it down to the set of resources that was actually selected. So in this case, this subscription has all of these resource groups, but I had only selected a few. Okay? And that means that the results of this set is not the full set that's available in the subscription, this set here. And so when the result comes back here, the result typically contains data for every VM in that subscription, which could be more than what's selected here. And so I need to remember to filter it down again. It's a little bit of work, but it's still the combined effect is it is significantly faster than in the other case. So remember to use this. I'll put more of these snippets in the help section. But resource first queries, use it. It's the right abstraction to use. There's a lot of tricks that you can do like this to speed it up. Give it a try. Thank you.